The Jewish world tracks its history back to three avos, three forefathers. And the Jewish experience centers on the Beis Hamikdash, which appears in three different stages, the first, second, and the future third Beis Hamikdash. And the avos and the three types of Beis Hamikdash are related to each other. Now, in order to understand how that works, we're going to observe two different ways of connection and commitment to our Judaism, and specifically the fact that Yaakov Avinu was the one who described bias, that there'd be a permanent structure, referring, of course, to the third Beis Hamikdash. Now, we see that all in this week's parsha, because with regards to the pasuk in this week's parsha, where it says, "Vayikra Hashem ha'makom hahu mekom hamikdash beis kel," that Yaakov Avinu named the area that would later be the site of the Beis Hamikdash, he called it the house of Hashem. So Isa b'Gemara, the Gemara says that Yaakov's expression is unique. Loi ka'Avram shekoseh b'Yihar. It's not like Avram Avinu, who called it a mountain, or about whom it is called a mountain. Shenemar asher ye'omer hayom b'har Hashem ye'ira'eh, like the pasuk says by the Akedah, that from that time and on this would be called a mountain where Hashem appears. V'loi ke'Yitzchak shekoseh b'Sadeh, and it's not like by Yitzchak, where it's referred to as a field. Shenemar, as the pasuk there says, Vayeitzei Yitzchak losuach basadeh, that Yitzchak went out to daven in the field. But rather, the ultimate Beis Hamikdash is like Yaakov, who called it a house. Shenemar vayikra Hashem ha'makom hahu beisel, that he called this place Beis Kel. That's why it says in Yeshaya, right near the beginning of Yeshaya, it says Beis Elekei Yaakov, that everybody will stream up to the house of the God of Yaakov, and it's not referred to as the house of Avram or Yitzchak, as we'll explain. So, Birum Meforshim Shegimel Hashemos Har Sodeh or Bayis, and the commentaries explain that these three expressions, the mountain, the field, and the house, Metzainim as Gimel Batei Hamikdashes, they refer to the three different Batei Mikdash. V'lochein Dafka Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi Mechone Bayis Amira Al Mokim Yusha B'Kvius. That's why the third Beis Hamikdash, which obviously will be the most permanent, is referred to as a house, which is a permanent structure. V'loi har v'sadeh, not a mountain or a field, which is, of course, neither designed for human habitat. Because that's the greatness of the third Beis Hamikdash. Because Dafka, the third Beis Hamikdash, will be eternal, unlike the two preceding Batei Mikdash that were destroyed. So that's why Yaakov is Dafka, the one who calls it a house, as we learned in the previous Sikha, because Yaakov's inheritance has no limits, no boundaries. As the parsha described earlier, that you burst through all the boundaries in all four directions. So there's a clear link. The Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi is the most permanent, and it's associated with Yaakov, who called the Beis Hamikdash Bayis. Okay, but we still need to understand what's going on over here, because miachar shedafka Yaakov k'ra'oi bayis, the fact that Yaakov specifically is the one who called the Beis Hamikdash a house. Don't you imagine that if Yaakov is the person who speaks to the permanence of the Beis Hamikdash, you would expect that to be reflected in his life? You'd expect him to live a life of permanence and stability. And at least relative to Avram and Yitzchak, who called the Beis Hamikdash more temporary, you'd expect that Yaakov's lifestyle should be more stable than theirs. And the facts are the opposite of Upayel Harehadrabah, to the contrary. Dafka Eitzel Yaakov you Dafka find that Yaakov appears to be the most transient, the most mobile of all the others. Particularly if you're comparing to Avram and Yitzchak. Because even Avram Avinu who traveled, and certainly Yitzchak who didn't, most of their life was in a single place. Look at Yaakov. Kol Yom of Yaakov Shel Gerbar. Yaakov, generally speaking, was like a foreigner. He didn't really belong. Like he tells Paro, he says, I had a difficult life. First, he has to run from Esav, as described in the beginning of this parasha, Vayeitzei Yaakov Beersheva, that he had to leave Beersheva. Then when he was in Haran, he specifies, like, I was a stranger there. When eventually Yaakov wants to settle down, he has the trauma of Yosef's abduction. So when does Yaakov eventually Vayechi live like a mensch? The last 17 years of his life. And that's in Mitzrayim. So how does it get from Yaakov, who has such an unsettled life, to be the person who chaps and represents the concept of the Beis Hamikdash in its permanent state, the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi? Doesn't seem to add up. So in order to understand that, we're going to look at how the prophecies are about coming to the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, that the whole world will want to participate in the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, which will lead us to understanding two different ways that we connect to Hashem. So let's start off by analyzing the quotation in the Gemara from Yeshayahu about Beis Yaakov Elikov. What is the full pasuk? It says, "V'holchu amim rabim." Many nations will go. They'll all say, "Let's go up to the mountain of Hashem, El Beis Elekei Yaakov, to the house of the God of Yaakov, and there v'yorenu midrachav. They will teach us from His ways, Hashem's ways, and we'll follow His path." Now this also doesn't seem to make sense. We get it, this is referring to the third Beis Hamikdash, and we know that the third Beis Hamikdash is called a house, but why is that relevant to this particular pasuk? Here the theme, the message of the pasuk is that nations of the world will want to come to the Beis Hamikdash to learn the ways of Hashem. Why is it relevant at this point to know that the Beis Hamikdash is called Bayis, which shows permanence? Why is it relevant here? And then the other part that we have to understand is how the pasuk concludes, because it says, all the nations are going to say, let's go and learn from the Beis Hamikdash. Says the pasuk, because Torah will emerge from Tzion and the word of Hashem from Yerushalayim. Now, ki pirusha nesinas tam. The word ki usually is an explanation. It's giving a reason for something. But that's going to raise two questions for us. Number one, bepashtus ein kavanas apostol she'ha'amim yovoyu al beis Elekei Yaakov kedei lizgayer v'lilmod Torah dvar Hashem. There's nothing in the pasuk that indicates that all of these nations streaming to Yerushalayim are doing so because they want to be able to convert and start observing Torah and mitzvahs. As you'll see from the pasuk that continues afterwards, that they're not necessarily becoming Jewish. So why is it a motivation for all these people to come up to Yerushalayim? Because that's where Torah comes from. But they're not looking to learn Torah. They want to know the ways of Hashem, but they don't necessarily want to become Jewish and observe Torah. And then, simply, aren't you saying the same thing twice? What's the double expression? Mitzion teitzesoira. Udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. They're not both saying the same thing. Is Tzion and Yerushalayim not synonymous? Is Torah and Dvar Hashem not synonymous? And for that matter, what's the double expression of what they're seeking? That you'll teach us your ways and we'll go in your paths. You're saying the same thing. So the easiest answer would be to say, well, the Torah repeats these phrases just to emphasize the point, how much they want to go and learn. But you don't want to repeat the identical words. You want it to sound nicer, so you change the language. Yerushalayim imkom Tzion, instead of saying Tzion twice, the second time you say Yerushalayim. Udvar Hashem imkom Torah, and the second time, instead of repeating Torah, you say Dvar Hashem. Same concept, right? That it's His ways, but we express it in different ways because we want to keep almost like a poetic license. And in fact, the commentaries on Tanakh point us out that in various places in Tanakh, that's what happens. The Torah uses similar expressions just, so to speak, for poetic justice. So to the contrary. Torah is not a flowery poetry. Torah, every single letter is carefully chosen. to the extent that we know that we'll learn a whole series of halachas if there's an extra word or an extra letter in the Torah or something that's used in a different expression. Even forget about halacha, even just reading the simple understanding of a pasuk, even if the words we're trying to analyze are words of shira, which is not even necessarily about halacha. Each time Rashi, who is the Pashton, who explains things simply, shows us why the Torah will repeat words. So it's not good enough just to say wonderful, beautiful, we just want it to sound nice. There are reasons why it says Tzion and Yerushalayim and Torah and Dvar Hashem and Yoreinu Midrachav and Nelcha Bar Chosav. We need to understand those reasons. So over here, we're not saying that there's a double expression that is effectively repeating the exact same thing. It's teaching us different messages. To teach us his paths, one thing. To go in his ways, another thing. The fact that Torah comes from Tzion and Udvar Hashem Yerushalayim, each one of those details will express and will explain. Every single one of them is specifically chosen. So where we'll start is, what's the difference between the expression Torah and the expression Devar Hashem? Let's start with that. Once we know that, then we can look at the difference between Tzion and Yerushalayim, and then we can look at the two different approaches of how the Goyim are going to come to Eretz Yisrael. Based on all of that, we'll get a really good understanding of the different types of Beis Hamikdash and why each one is associated with a particular one of the patriarchs. So, starting at the beginning, what's the difference between the expression Torah and the expression Devar Hashem? We know the Gemara tells us Devar Vayeitzei halacha. When we use the expression Devar Hashem, we're talking about halacha, which is Devar halacha berura, something that is clear and unequivocal. It has been decided. This is the way it is. It is no longer negotiable. Ma she'en kein Torah, which is different to Torah. Torah expresses the entire experience of argument, debate, proofs, counterproofs, questions, examination, and exploration. Particularly if it's juxtaposed against the expression Devar Hashem, which is clear, absolute halacha. So Torah is the word Torah includes all the give and take, and even those things that are eventually rejected as not the final answer. To be more specific, when we analyze, for example, minhag, we find when it comes to minhag may be different from locale to locale. In one place, the minhag is this way. In the other place, the minhag is that way. Here you do work on Erev Pesach before Chatzos, here you don't. Here's the minhag may differ from place to place. Even with regards to outright halacha, more than minhag, it may be different from place to place. Like the Gemara says clearly, in Rav's hometown, in Rav's city, he's the posek, the halacha follows Rav. In Shmuel's city, he's the posek, the halacha follows Shmuel. Even when we talk about the classic debates between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, until we reach a point where Nimnu v'Gomru, where there's a consensus, and we say, okay, now the halacha follows Beis Hillel. Until that point, in Beis Hillel's community, they followed the halacha of Hillel. In Beis Shammai's community, they followed the halacha of Shammai. So what do you see? That there is some element of the possibility of different halacha in different places. Yes, sir, Al-Kain. Take it a step further. Let's say we now paskin a particular halacha and we say we follow Beis Hillel, which means that if you do now follow Beis Shammai's view, once we've rendered the halacha like Beis Hillel, it has no validity at all. Still, even if it's not valid in practice, it's still 100% Torah from the living God. You dare not ever suggest that the so-called unaccepted halachic opinion is not a Torah opinion. It's 100% Torah, it's just not relevant in practice. If a person would suggest that a piece of Torah which did not make the final cut for how we practice, if you would suggest that that is not Torah, that is somebody who rejects the whole of Torah. As the Rambam clearly says that if a person were to suggest that even one piece of the oral Torah is not valid and part of Torah, that person is rejecting the entire Torah. Beyond that, even a suggested concept in the Gemara, or even a question raised in the Gemara, is 100% Torah, as it was presented at Sinai. So if you were to learn only the suggestion and only the question in this particular Gemara, and you don't get today to learn the answer to the question or the decision of what the halacha is, you have to say the brachas for limud haTorah, ve'omer al asalkedaitech ve'hakushya. You say about this particular question which will later be rejected, or this particular suggestion which will not be accepted, you say, including the particular view that is not accepted la halacha, you say about it, so that Hashem gave us His Torah. So what are we seeing? Devar Hashem is the actual practical halacha, and the practical halacha is non-negotiable. Torah includes all the elements of the discovery of a concept in Torah, including those that don't make it into practicality. That's the distinction between Torah and Devar Hashem. Now, when you look at all the different opinions and all the debates within the Gemara, all the arguments, questions, suggestions, and we say that they're all they're all part of Torah, right? They're all part of the living God's word. Bottom line, there'll only be one halacha, and it will only follow one opinion. Like the Gemara says about David HaMelech, what does it mean that Hashem is with an individual? Here it's talking about David HaMelech, but it extends to any person. Means that the halacha is decided like their view. Meaning so what do we see over here? It says, that opinion that is decided to be the final halacha, that links to a much higher experience of divine revelation represented by the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, as opposed to all the various opinions where they are v'shem Elu v'Elu divrei Elokim chayim. They are connected to the name Elokim, which is a lesser exposure of godliness. But they're both valid names of Hashem that dare not be erased. So just to explain this more clearly, Elokim, the name Elokim, Gam Elokim, Chaim, Shulam, Mailam Elokim, Stam, even when I don't only refer to Hashem as Elokim, but Elokim Chaim, which is a higher level than the generic term Elokim, Hu L'Shoin Rabim, is always a plural word. Why a plural word? The name Elokim allows the possibility for diversity and for multiplicity. Kvayochel, so to speak. Not chas v'sholem that Hashem is more than one, but allows and accommodates the possibility of entities to believe that they exist in a state of multiplicity. So that will reflect in Torah. If I'm looking at Torah through the lens of Elokim, even Elokim Chaim, seeing as that is a world of diversity, it allows for the possibility of diverse opinions within Torah, all of which are authentic, but they are different. Aval Havaya. But when I refer by the name Havaya, which is Shema Mefoira, Shema Etzem, Shema Meyuchot, the explicit name of Hashem, the unique name of Hashem, the essence name of Hashem, and therefore Lemaila Mehischalkos, a dimension of godliness which is beyond the possibility of diversity, beyond the possibility of multiplicity, it's absolute oneness. Havaya imoy, where Havaya is in the mix, there can only be one unequivocal conclusion, one halacha. This helps us to understand another layer of depth to the distinction between referring to Torah as Torah or referring to Torah specifically as Dvar Havaya, the word of Havaya. Now we understand it's not just Hashem's word as the final say, but Dafka Dvar Havaya, the expression of Havaya, which is absolute unity and does not allow for diversity. As we've already noted, Torah includes all the broad range of opinions, including those opinions that are not accepted as the final say. Which means that those other opinions could teach us lessons in other areas of Jewish life, not necessarily in halacha. Mashenkin dvar havaya, but when we use the expression dvar havaya, hu kileshena gemora dvar havaya zoi halacha. But when you're talking about dvar havaya, the exposure of the essence of Hashem through Torah, that is immutable. That is halacha. It is in stone. Now we can understand the pasuk that says mitzion teitzei soira. From Tzion you get Torah udvar havaya mishalayim, and you get Devar Havaya, that absolute clarity and unequivocal expression of godliness, dafka from Yerushalayim. Meaning, Inyan HaTorah shayach leTzion, Dvar Havaya Yerushalayim, which means that there's a link between Torah and Tzion, and Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim, so therefore we have to understand what is the difference between Tzion and Yerushalayim. Yadua, if you ever want to understand what something is, the Torah names that are given to things are not arbitrary. They're very carefully chosen, and they illustrate the essence of what that particular thing is. So the name Tzion tells a story, and the name Yerushalayim tells a different story. Tzion and Yerushalayim are both names for the same city. Nevertheless, in a kol echad mishem eselu moire al inyan o ma'ile nifredes shebe'ir zoi. Each name emphasizes a particular quality of this unique holy city. Hashem Tzion. What is the meaning of Tzion? Tzion in its direct translation is lashon siman. It's an indicator. Like the expression in Tanakh that says, establish for yourself, set for yourself markers, indicators, like a Tzion on a grave. It's called a tzion, a marker of where somebody is buried. So that's a siman. It's an indicator of something else. When I refer to Yerushalayim as tzion, I'm saying that Yerushalayim, the city, represents something else of a spiritual value. Like the Gemara famously tells us, that the physical city of Yerushalayim corresponds to a spiritual reality of Yerushalayim, which is, so to speak, directly opposite or mirrored by it. So Tzion means this city is supposed to hyperlink you to a spiritual reality that is not present. V'Hashem Yerushalayim, but when I actually use the word Yerushalayim, Moira ala Maile de'ira shamayim she'eshna ba. Yerushalayim comes from the root yirah, awe of God, that is already present. It's not just a link or a reminder for somewhere else, it's already present. Like the Medrash famously tells us, Yerushalayim is a composite of two words, Yirah and Sholem, complete, absolute awe of God. So if I'm talking about the city as Yerushalayim, I'm describing a place where the individuals who are in that place experience absolute awe of God. They're overwhelmed by awe of God. If I'm talking about Tzion, I'm talking about people who link with or relate to or are reminded of a spiritual reality. If I'm talking about Yerushalayim, they experience a tangible Yiras Hashem. Okay, mevor al pasuk, like the pasuk says, and we explain about it, that when it comes to Ma'aseh Sheni, the Torah tells us that one of the reasons you do it is in order that it should help you to have Yiras Hashem all your life. So there, the explanation is how does Ma'aseh Sheni bring this Yiras Hashem? So we say, because Shiriyas Mekoim Shechina, you come to Yerushalayim to eat your Ma'aseh Sheni, so you see the place where the Shechina is present. V'koyanim b'avodosim, you see the koyanim on duty. Ulevim b'duchonim, the Levim standing and singing. V'yisov b'maimodam, and the allocated representatives of the Jewish community who watch the Karbonos Tzibor. Being in that world makes you feel Yiras Hashem. So being in Yerushalayim actually instills Yiras Shamayim in a person. So now we've got two states of spiritual awareness, Tzion, and a deeper state, Yerushalayim. So Beis Hamikdash Kayom is Gamadargas Havoida Shel Bnei Yisrael. What's much more valuable to us is not just to know how Yerushalayim operates as a city, but to understand what these two realities mean and our connection to and service of Hashem. Keshem Shakadosh Baruch Hu Bochar be'Eretz Yisrael, Just like Hashem allocated and chose Eretz Yisrael to be the special land on earth, Kach gam bocher lechelka Yisrael, he also chose us to be his special nation. Which is why we have characteristics that are similar to Eretz Yisrael and vice versa. And so therefore, in the same way as Yerushalayim, which is the apex of Eretz Yisrael, has two facets to it, one represented by Tzion and one by Yerushalayim. And we have to be able to identify that within our Avodas Hashem, there's a Tzion element and a Yerushalayim element. Yerushalayim is Al Shem Yirav Al Shem Sholem. We said Yerushalayim is the name that represents completeness and awe of Hashem. Meaning, in Yonah Bavoida, what does it mean to us? Madregas Tachlis Ushleimus Hayirav Abitul. It means we have reached the ultimate state of awe of Hashem and therefore surrender submission to Hashem. If I use the word Yerushalayim, I'm referring to a person who has worked so hard on themselves that their entire reality is complete dedication to Hashem. Tzion, on the other hand, is Miloshon Siman, as we already said. It's like an indicator, it's a sign, it's a representation. That's who ofen avoida ashal yodoi ba'adam yisoli etzin v'siman linyonim nanim belikus l'mayla. A person who has achieved the level of tzion in their avoida means I now become someone who represents a higher level of connection to Hashem. The person still remains themselves and isn't completely surrendered to Hashem. But this is somebody who has refined themselves to such a point that they now become the representative of higher, loftier, more spiritual things. The fact remains that that person is still an entity of their own, independent. And so here's a person who's investing effort to try and understand Torah to the best of his ability. That's exactly what the person will succeed in doing, understanding Torah to the best of his ability. So what's the result of Tzion? What's the result of a person whose entire dedication to Hashem is that they're working on themselves, but they haven't yet reached complete, absolute submission to Hashem? What comes from them? Torah. That means that as long as a person feels that I am still I, but I'm dedicated to the cause, that will bring a person to an understanding which is called Torah. As we already mentioned before, Torah allows the possibility of diverse opinions, means to say that the type of learning that a person will do when they are this tzion, this marker of godliness in the world, working on themselves in an incredible way, is that they will still be able to see things that are not necessarily exactly according to the halacha. They'll entertain a variety of different views. Because as we've mentioned, this is a person whose Torah learning will be relative to their individual personality. The average personality entertains the possibility of different opinions. Like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, each person relative to their intellectual abilities and relative to their soul root. It's not a bad thing. Seeing as this is somebody who has worked to become a representation of higher ideals of Kedusha. So it's not like he's going to teach or come to conclusions that are off the wall or contrary to truth. Every different opinion angle that the person presents will be true Torah. All the great and wonderful thoughts and processes that this person has had are all evolutions from and therefore they remain a sign and reminder of it's all part of the fact that Elokim, which is Elokus, it is godliness, allows the possibility for diversity. So what part of Torah do I key into if I'm still a me, if I'm still a Metzius? Into the part of Elokus, the part of Torah that can be translated into all kinds of diverse opinions. That all talks to the reality of understanding Torah, and understanding could be a totally theoretical experience, which may not yet translate into what you do in practice. The truth is, as long as I'm learning Torah for learning's sake, it's not the end of the world if I'm still entertaining diverse opinions, because I'm not yet deciding what to do in practice. But when I have to decide, what do I actually do? All the svaras, lekan or lekan, what do I do in practice? I dare not rely on just the tzion dimension that entertains possibilities to decide the practical halacha. When I have the onus of choosing what the halacha is going to be, I need proper yira. I need bittul. I need devar avai to come from where? Mirushalayim. Okay, mevur b'emshech samech vav. Like the Rabbi explains in Samech Vav, she efshe lifseik halacha be'emes lamitoy ki malidei shleimus hayira. That it's impossible for a person to decide a halacha accurately unless that person has absolute yiras Hashem. Kasher adam yarei shem chalila psak halacha sheloi lo yeh mechuven kfirat ha'elyon. As long as a person is afraid lest I get my conclusion wrong and it does not match up to what Hashem wants, or worse, chas v'shalom, if I get this wrong, I could go against what Hashem wants. Only if a person has that real acute yira shamayim, then they'll be able to paskan halacha correctly. Even if the subject on the table is only a so-called lesser law instituted by the rabbis, or if it's only something of a more recent nature from one of the brilliant students who the Torah allows to be able to innovate within Torah, if I have Yira Shamayim, then I recognize I know what's at stake over here. The words conveyed to Moshe at Har Sinai, Hashem's Ratzon. What's the difference to me if Hashem decided that this halacha should be derabanan or deraisa? It doesn't change. It's what Hashem wants. And therefore, Yorehu Shema Psak Halacha Lamaisa Sheloi, the person is afraid lest their rendering of the halacha shall Yodoi Yase Yehudi Maisa Befoil, based on which somebody's going to actually make a decision and act in a particular way. The person is absolutely paralyzed by fear of coming to the wrong conclusion that might go against what Hashem wants. That Yira Shamayim propels the person to invest so much more effort and so much more depth in their analysis of Torah until they're absolutely sure that they will be directed to the correct halachic outcome. That explains why we say the word of Hashem comes from Yerushalayim. Shleimus hayira. Where does the word of Hashem halacha come from? Absolute yira shamayim. To be able to focus and be aligned with the correct halacha, it's not good enough just to have ordinary yira shamayim. Like a yiras ha'onesh. If a person is afraid of punishment consequences, that's not going to keep them focused. Or even a more advanced kind of yira, to be afraid of losing a connection with Hashem. The thing that is required to ensure that a person paskins halacha correctly is absolute yira. Shema lo yechavein l'ratzon ha'elyon. The fear of lest I not align with what Hashem wants. That will bring me to proper halacha. So now we get it. Tzion and Yerushalayim represent two levels of dedication to Hashem. Tzion is in process, and Yerushalayim is absolute dedication. Therefore, Tzion can produce the whole range of Torah. Only Yerushalayim can produce halacha, devar havaya, the singular reality and truth of how this should be translated into practice. Now we speak about this ki mitzvah tetzasora when on Simchas Torah at Hakafos. That will help us to understand why it belongs in Hakafos and why in its particular placement in Hakafos. Say the psuke Ata Horesa Nema Lifnei Hakafos, the Ata Horesa psukim which we say is a prelude to the Hakafos, Mistayim bepasuk Kimitzin Teitzei Dvaravai Mishalom, concludes with that pasuk Kimitzin. But the moving it does seem a bit odd. Okay. It's one thing that we're only using part of the pasuk, and the pasuk appears with variations in Yeshaya and Micha. We're not saying the whole pasuk. We get that. We could explain simply. Because only this segment of the pasuk is relevant to the theme of the pre-Hakafos verses. Fine. So then why do we start with the word ki? We should say, why do we say ki? Because links you to the pasuk that precedes. The whole point of ki is that whatever we just read in the preceding pasuk is a reason or is linked to this reason. Why are we using the word ki if we're not quoting that part of the pasuk that is relevant to the ki, to the because? Because what? You're not telling me what. Fascinating insight. You have no choice but to say this, the fact that we include the word ki in the psukim of Ataresa is loy al tchilas pasuk ze b'shayo micha elo ala pasuk sheim kodim lechen nifnei hakafos. We're not linking this ki mitzion to the preceding words in either Yeshaya or Micha. We're saying ki to the previous pasuk we've just said before hakafos, which is malchuscha malchus kol elamim u'memshaltcha b'chol dor v'dor, that Hashem's kingdom extends over all worlds and His dominion over all generations. And we'll have to analyze what is the difference between malchus and memshala, kingship and dominion, and how does it link to mitzion and Torah and Yerushalayim and Dvaravaya. Ve'in kol stira lekach mizeh shebimakir b'shayim micha mitzin teitzei Torah hutam al tchilas hakosiv sham. So, okay, the fact that we're now linking it to Malchus Kol Elamim does not undermine in any way that in its original context, the key is linked to that immediate context. Because obviously that context in Yeshaya is totally different to this context of Malchus. It's not out of the question, we find it in many places, that a single reason could create various outcomes. Okay. That's not a big question. The question is, what's the link to Malchuscha? But at the same time we have to say, but it's not arbitrary. The fact that we could use Ki Mitzin Teitzei Torah to talk about all the non-Jews coming and wanting to learn from Torah as described in Yeshaya, and we can use Ki Mitzin to connect to Malchus Kol Elamim, there must be a link between the two of them, and we have to discover that link. Now, b'pashtus mashma, at face value, it's clear. Shebeis halashonos malchuscha malchus kol elamim. The one expression which is that Hashem, your dominion is, your kingdom is the kingdom of all worlds. And then the second one, that your dominion extends over all generations. Shavim b'toichnam really seem to be saying the same message. And then maybe we should say, as we said earlier, the Torah is just repeating the same language because it wants to emphasize the message that Hashem is the absolute ruler. And would also say, similar to what we said before, that the reason that the wording is changed slightly is because it's like poetic license. But as we already noted earlier in the Sikha, we don't play those games with Tanakh, just repeat words to emphasize things and change it up a little bit so it sounds nice. There's got to be a deep message. And just as we saw a deep message in the difference between Tzion and Yerushalayim and Torah and Dvaravaya, we have to see a similar deep message in the difference between Malchuscha and Memshaltcha. To start, what is the big difference between the concept of kingship and dominion? Is that Melucha miskabeles biratzon. The minute you say Melech, you're talking about a leader who the community wants as their leader. Kiloshin, as we say in davening, that we accepted Hashem's kingship over us willingly. Whereas memshala is by force, against your will. So these two possibilities of how Hashem rules over the world, either with a willing audience or by force, they're key. They're because of. Why are there two possibilities of how Hashem rules over the world? Because they're two possibilities of how we accept Hashem's word. And of course how that translates into our personal avodah. And of course it also does touch on the concept of Tzion Yerushalayim as two different states of the city of Yerushalayim. So let's look at it this way. Mitzad bechinas Torah. When I'm talking from the perspective of Torah, which we've already identified, which is where the human being uses human ability to be able to understand something. Can a person understanding to the best of their human abilities. Whatever you understand, you enjoy. That's how it is. You're enthusiastic about things that you could relate to and that you could appreciate, that you could understand. And of course we know that the greatness of Torah learning is that it propels us to actually do what we've learned, to translate it into practice. So when you've really understood something well and therefore you're excited about it, when you actually come to put it into practice, you'll do it in practice with a sense of enjoyment and excitement. Koloimar, meaning mitzad b'chinas tzin v'Torah, if I'm coming from the angle of tzin and Torah, mekabel adam el malchus shamayim be'efen shel malchuscha malchus kol elamim beratzon, then I accept Hashem's leadership and Hashem's kingship willingly, because I'm living in a space that I'm enjoying and appreciating what I've learned, what I've understood, and therefore I'm willing to accept. Avol b'shah sheba halemed lidvar havaya. But when a person's learning Torah from the perspective of Dvar Halacha, Dvar Havai, which means what? Lifsei Halacha Lemaisa. To decide what the practical halacha should be. And then not only to decide the halacha, but to apply the halacha. This is not a place to be reliant on what I understand and appreciate and enjoy. To the contrary. Human bias will lead me through my understanding very often to arrive at a conclusion that is against the halacha. So how do I keep myself focused and on the straight and narrow? Specifically when a person is willing to reach the level of Yerushalayim, complete dedication, submission to Hashem. Then machriach hu es atzmoi. Then you're willing to force yourself, umevatel atzmoi mikol v'chol, and to put yourself completely aside. V'azai hu ba lidei klita v'hargosha shel haratzon ha'elim, which allows you then to absorb and accept what Hashem really wants, not what I want. B'chinas havaya, the absolute pristine version of godliness. Umechaven halacha be'emes lamitosa, and then I get to the correct halacha according to absolute truth. V'oisa kein lamaisa, and I actually apply the halacha. Even if applying the halacha is completely against my seichel. That means when I learn Torah from an angle of Dvar Havai, which means I'm looking how to apply this in practice, which is obviously going to then propel me to fulfill mitzvahs as they should be fulfilled. How and why would I do that? Only by a willingness to surrender my metzias completely, dugmas inyan ha-memshala, which is similar to the idea of memshala, that Hashem has dominion over me. So there you see it. Torah comes from Tzion and is aligned with Malchus. It's a pleasurable, personalized experience. Dvar Havaya, which is halacha, comes from Yerushalayim, complete submission, which is the concept of memshala. Now, seeing as the whole Jewish nation, and specifically each individual, the idea of being Jewish is not just that I should be perfect in my service of Hashem, but I'm supposed to impact the entire world, that the entire world is as perfect as it should be. V'gam mitzad psak Rambam, like the Rambam gives a very clear example of this, that we have responsibility to the nations of the world. That Tziva Moshe Rabbeinu mipi hagvura lochoif es kol boi ha'olam lekabel mitzvah shenitztavu b'nei Noach, that Moshe Rabbeinu was instructed by Hashem to tell us to influence the whole world to observe their 7 Noachide laws. And how should they keep those 7 Noachide laws? Not because the Noachide laws are a beautiful way to keep a holistic, healthy society, but rather because that's what Hashem said at Sinai. So therefore it's not good enough that we, within the beautiful, pristine, spiritual Jewish world, that we should have these 2 levels of Torah, that which we absorb and relate to in a personal way, and Dvar Havaya, that which we accept with Hashem's authority. It actually has to go beyond that. The message has to spread out there to the rest of the world. Through Tzion, we'll be able to spread the theme of Torah. That will influence the nations of the world, that they want to know, they want to learn. What's Torah? Where it's meaningful to me, it's personal to me. So that influences the nations of the world. Let me come to Yerushalayim so I can learn what is meaningful to me. To learn their 7 mitzvahs, so even though in order to be able to do the 7 mitzvahs, you have to be willing to submit and to surrender your personal interests in favor of what Hashem wants, still, it's personal. It's personal. It should be something that you appreciate. And then the second part, which is that the Dvar Havaya should not only affect us, that we get to the state of Yerushalayim, but should go from Yerushalayim and should be shared. That influences the nations of the world, that they should walk in Hashem's path, which means not just that they should understand these things, but they should apply them in their lives. Halicha, walking, is related to the word halacha. That's an expression of absolute submission to Hashem, which means that they should be willing to listen and to accept all the 7 Noachide laws as they are Hashem's word. The same applies to these 2 realities of Hashem being king in an acceptable or attractive way, or a moishel in a so-called strong-handed way. They're directly relative to the 2 possible causes, the Tzion approach or the Yerushalayim approach. Meaning to say, if we're out there teaching the world the Torah approach, what's going to happen? They'll accept Hashem as their melech, willingly accept Hashem as their king. As the pasuk says, all of the worlds will happily embrace Hashem as their king. And by us sharing and spreading the concept of absolute Yira, which is represented by Yerushalayim, that influences the world to be even accept the things of Hashem that they don't understand and appreciate. Means we can influence the world to be in a state of complete submission to Hashem, even beyond what they understand and appreciate. Now, any concept that exists can manifest in 2 possible ways. There's the general sense of a particular concept, and the very specific details of how it actually plays out. The same applies here. At face value, the pasuk in Yeshaya is describing the future. The Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, that's when everybody's going to come streaming to Yerushalayim to learn. That's when we'll have the ultimate spreading of Torah and Dvar Havaya from Yerushalayim to the rest of the world. And therefore, and that's why we'll have the absolute height of acceptance of Hashem's authority in both realms, the Melech and the Moishel. That's generically, that it all applies to the time of Mashiach, but more specifically we can split it up. In the same way as you could obviously distinguish between how things are now in the time of Golus and how they were in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. So, in addition to that, obviously in the time of the Beis Hamikdash there was absolute revealed godliness. So obviously if there's revealed godliness, how was everybody serving Hashem? With love and with excitement and enthusiasm, because they could see it, they could experience, they could relate to it. Which obviously gave them a tremendous beauty and experience and satisfaction and pleasure out of the avodah that they did. Which is quite absent in today's world. When elikus is not really apparent. Primarily the way that we serve Hashem now is not so much from the pleasure of the experience, but from dedication to the experience. The truth is we can make a similar distinction between the first and second Beis Hamikdash. We'll make a similar, of course not identical, but a similar distinction between the first and second Beis Hamikdash. Bayis Rishon nivne al yedei Shlomo HaMelech bizman shekayim Asir b'Shlomusa. The first Beis Hamikdash was built by Shlomo HaMelech at a time of the zenith of the Jewish nation, the so-called full moon phase of the Jewish history. Which means Shleimus Hagilu Delikus Mibchinas Bina Alma Decheru. It means it's a time that was tremendous revelation of godliness, and from a very lofty spiritual level, from the level of Bina, which means that people had a meaningful personal relationship with the experience of Elikus, and it was considered Alma Decheru, a place, a reality of absolute freedom. Which is why the Jews had absolutely no concerns from any of the surrounding nations. To the contrary, the surrounding nations all came and brought tribute to the Beis Hamikdash. So that had two impacts on the world. The first is that the Beis Hamikdash was able to influence the world in a very elevated way. And the second thing is that the avodah of the Jewish people was in a very revealed way. So that was ahava, that was a relationship with Elikus, which is complete love. Hashem imitates the Torah canal, and this is the principle called Tzion, from where Torah emerges, as we've already discussed. Whereas in the second Beis Hamikdash, there was not that kind of revelation. Like the Gemara comments on the pasuk that says Ikavda chaser hey, that Ikavda without the hey, referring to hey dvarim chaser b'bayisheni, that there were 5 elements missing in the second Beis Hamikdash. Orin v'kapoires v'chul, it lists the 5 things, the urim v'tumim, etc. So there's less Gilo Yalikos. And at the time, the second Beis Hamikdash, we were still under the sway of other nations, and we had to get their permission in order to build the Beis Hamikdash. And then there were other nations that came in and took over, and Chelek and the Romans, etc. At that period of time, the main way that we served Hashem was through Yira and Bittul, because the love was lacking. We can see a similar thing. Similar distinction we can draw now between Hashem as the king we want to have, or the memshala that, so to speak, imposes itself on us. That also plays out in these two time periods and how they're different from each other. At the time of the first Beis Hamikdash, the Seder of how Hashem presented in the world was like a melech. Firstly, with regards to the Jewish people, because as we've already said, it was a time of tremendous revelation, so it was a time of great embrace. They were excited and enthusiastic to accept Hashem's authority. And that spilled over into the world, so it was generally a peaceful time in the world at large. Whereas the second Beis Hamikdash, Hashem's interaction with the world was this heavy-handed interaction, which influences first us and then the world. Firstly, it affects us that our primary way to serve Hashem is avoida beyira al yedei kfir vehechrech. How do we serve Hashem? Out of awe and fear of God, which means that it's almost like we're forced to do it. And that spilled over into the world, which was a time where the world was at war. And various nations over that period had the upper hand over the Jewish people. So the only thing that could keep us safe was if the world was aware of the fact, of felt that Hashem is the dominating force over and above all of their forces. Okay, so what do we have? Malchus, willing, beautiful acceptance of Hashem, is tied into Tzion and Torah, which is a personal experience, a loving experience of Torah learning, because I relate to it, as we had in the first Beis Hamikdash. Memshala, which is the strong arm of Hashem, is related to Yerushalayim, complete Yira, which is necessary in order to decide Halacha Devar Havaya, and that was primarily the mode of connection during the second Beis Hamikdash. We'll now link those to the Avois. We can now link the three Batei Mikdash to the three Avos, each one, of course, reflecting a similar theme. Avodas Avrami bekava Chesed. Avram Avinu's entire means of serving Hashem was in the Chesed channel, which is Midas Ha'ahava. That's where you show incredible love of Hashem, like the Pasuk testifies. Avram Oyavi. Avram is the one who loves me. So how does Avram impact the world? In a chesed ahava way. Shower the world with revelation. Inspire everybody so that they should be moved by your inspiration. Very similar to the mode of avodah in the first place. We love being here. It's so inspiring. We want to be here. And that's why this particular avodah, the mode of avodah through ahava, is specifically related to Tzion and Torah, as previously explained, because in Yon Shel Avram hu heyosei Tzion v'simin lebchinas chesed shebatzilus. What is a Tzion? We said a person here who is a sign and a representation of something higher. Avram Avinu here on earth was a sign and a representation of chesed atzilus, the ultimate state of divine kindness. Because Avram Avinu's entire approach to serving Hashem is through chesed, how does that translate? Pleasurable, beautiful, loving. As we say in Chassidus, that the nature of love, even the highest level of love, is you still have a sense of self. I love. That's why some people find it an offensive statement. Why is I first? Because yesh mi shoyev, I love. Avodas Yitzchak bekava gvura. Then you have Yitzchak, next generation, completely opposite mode of connection to Hashem. That is Avodas Hashem through gvura, which translates into bechinas yira ubitel. It translates into absolute submission to Hashem. Like Yaakov Avinu says about his father, upachad Yitzchak hayoli. The fear of Yitzchak is referring, of course, to Hashem, but is relating over here that Yitzchak's connection to Hashem is one of fear. That's very much like the second Beis Hamikdash time period. Which links it to Devar Havaya, which requires Yerushalayim. Because what you will find with Yitzchak is much more of the sense of awe and fear of God, Yerushalayim, complete submission, much more than you'd find with Avram Avinu. Where does Yaakov come in? Yaakov, who is the ultimate of the three, who is Kavoim Tzoi, the harmonizing central channel, Tiferes, beauty HaKoilas, Beis HaKavin, which is able to amalgamate, to synthesize both extremes. He's able to synthesize healthy chesed, love and kindness and enthusiasm and enjoyment. Together with the avodah of Yitzchak, which is kava gvura v'ayira, the stand back, absolute fear of God. Gimel. That's why he represents the third Beis Hamikdash. Asher oz ti haiskalos shel Beis Hamaylos. The third Beis Hamikdash will harmonize the greatness of Avram and the greatness of Yitzchak, the greatness of Beis Rishon, the greatness of Beis Sheni. Tachlis hashleimus de giloy elekos yoser mashahoye beBeis Rishon bechinas Tzion. On the one hand, the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi will have the ultimate revelation of godliness, which is an Avram-esque kind of approach. Shower the world with awareness of Hashem, and it will be even greater than the first Beis Hamikdash. So that's Bechinas Tzion v'Torah, something relatable and enjoyable. And simultaneously, the third Beis Hamikdash will allow us access to the experience of complete submission to Hashem, Yitzchak's Kav. Now that we've gone through this entire explanation, understanding the link between Ahava and Torah and Tzion and Malchus on the one hand, and Yira and Memshala and Dvar Havaya and Yerushalayim on the other hand, and how Yaakov brings them all together into a healthy synthesis, now now we can understand why Yaakov is dafka the one who ascertains the eternal nature of the Beis Hamikdash. Dafka Yaakov kara oibayis, by being the only one to call it a house, a permanent structure. And why this is relevant when we talk about all the various nations of the world, Asher Yomer, that they'll say, not just simply that we should go after the Beis Hamikdash to learn, but Dafka el Beis Elokei Yaakov v'gomer. They have to attribute it specifically to Yaakov. Why? Generally speaking, in all realities, in spiritual terms, generally speaking, you always have to imagine that there will be Zeh le'uma zeh. Whatever exists has a counterpart that opposes it. Every healthy, holy trait has an equal and opposite unholy trait that interferes with it. So, just as a person could in a positive way have love of Hashem, in a negative way could have misdirected love to bad things. And just like Yiras Hashem is a very powerful, beautiful thing, but the negative could be that a person has anxiety or anger, which is also related to Yira. V'loshen Chazal, to use the expression of Chazal, that what emerged from and eventually was disconnected from Avram is a Yishmael, an unhealthy love for the wrong things. And likewise from Yitzchak, what emerged and eventually disconnected from Yitzchak, unhealthy Yira. And that's why any one of the midos on its own may peter out. A great example of this, of course, will be all the people that Avraham Avinu succeeded in touching and influencing and converting, and they did not last. Because any extreme midah will find extreme challenge and will eventually collapse. The same problem occurred in the two Batei Mikdash. Because each of the Batei Mikdash focused on one specific area. Bais Rishon, love and inspiration. Bais Sheni, Yira and submission. Therefore, there's the possibility of a pushback and a nemesis, which eventually destroys that Beis Hamikdash. Whereas Yaakov's midah is neither extreme but rather Yaakov is able to harmonize and hold the two separate and different midos together. So he's immune to any nemesis. That's why Yaakov is dafka the one who succeeds in seeing all of his children remain dedicated to the cause. Which is relevant to the third Beis Hamikdash. That's exactly what will happen in the third Beis Hamikdash, because it will have both components together, both the element of Tzion and the element of Yerushalayim. That's why it will be stable and it will last forever, and that's the link to Yaakov. That's why it's relevant for us to know in the pasuk that it says that many nations will go, and what will they say? That they'll say, let's go not just to the mountain of Hashem, but dafka to the house of Yaakov's God. And they say, why? Because what? It's got both. It will have both components, the Torah and Tzion, and the Dvar Havai Yerushalayim. Like you see in normal, real terms. When can you impact and influence somebody else? You can only influence somebody else if the person you're trying to influence detects that you are for real, that you're genuine. Same thing. In order for us as the Jewish people to influence the rest of the world, we cannot be extremists and say there's only one way to serve Hashem. Either the way of enthusiasm and getting to understand things in a personal way, or the way of complete submission, and that's it. We need to be able to accommodate both. We have to have the sense of personal connection and personal pleasure and enjoyment in our Judaism, within which you can detect the absolute submission to Hashem. Which means that even when you're loving Hashem and even when you're understanding Torah, you should feel in that complete submission to Hashem. And the other way, that even when you're submitting yourself completely to Hashem, in that experience you should enjoy and feel a personal connection to that. When a person is able to harmonize both, then your avodah is true, which is Yaakov's trait. That becomes your reality, which is, if it's your reality, it's never going to pause or stop. And that will get the rest of the world to want to come and learn from you. That will excite the nation of the world. We want to learn from you our mitzvahs. And we want to apply them because we see that you have this healthy balance and you have this emes. We want the emes too.